Good afternoon and welcome to Radcliffe. My name is Janet Rich Edwards and I am an epidemiologist and also the Life Sciences Advisor to the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. And we are so pleased to see you here. I'm excited. We had to move this talk from a smaller room into this auditorium to accommodate your interest. This talk is one of several in a series on epidemics. I hope you were with us back in October when we did a day-long event. But in addition to today's talk, I want to let you know that there are cards in the back that include the dates of our final two lectures in this series, including one on obesity, is more complex than you think, on March 27th, and then another one on Alzheimer's, the enigma, the cause of the dementia epidemic, on April 23rd. For today, I have the pleasure of introducing Abdul El-Sayed to you. He's the former health commissioner of the city of Detroit. He has a medical degree from Columbia University and was a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford, where he earned his doctorate in public health. He is a native Michigander who grew up in Metro Detroit. As many of you know, he's running for governor for the state of Michigan and launched his gubernatorial campaign after witnessing the systematic failures in Flint and across the state. He left his position as an assistant professor in Columbia's Department of Epidemiology to return to Michigan. He became the youngest health official in a major American city when Mayor Mike Duggan appointed Abdul to rebuild Detroit's health department after it was privatized during the city's bankruptcy. As health commissioner, he was responsible for the health and safety of over 670,000 Detroiters. He worked tirelessly to ensure government accountability and transparency, to promote health, and to reduce cross-generational poverty. And today's lecture will deal with that, the epidemic of poverty, the government imperative. Please join me in welcoming Abdul El-Sayed.
All right, good afternoon. So you gotta forgive me, I'm as a politician now, the town hall style just never leaves you, so good afternoon. Thank you, hey. It is an honor and a privilege to be here today, to Dr. Rich Edwards and the conveners. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak and to talk about an issue that I believe animates much of our work if we're people who are oriented to solving the challenge of human suffering. I started my career as a physician and epidemiologist. I'm now running for governor. And to just sort of orient you as to why, I was never supposed to run for office. In fact, the first time anybody with any degree of knowledge of the political process suggested that I should run for governor, it was at my college commencement. I was the valedictorian of my class at the University of Michigan and was selected to give the student speech. Now, the speaker that anybody, including my own parents, actually came to listen to was President Bill Clinton. And I got to give my student speech, and President Clinton gave his actual speech, and he was so kind as to mention my speech in his speech. Now, it was the first time my Egyptian immigrant father ever mentioned anything related to pride and my name in the same sentence, which was great. But after the speech, President Clinton, sort of sought me out, and he turned me around and said, "Son, why are you going to med school?" And that's not a question that anybody asks a graduating senior who's going to medical school, right? And I just looked at him for a minute. The first thing that came to my mind was, well, President Clinton, we're brown. That's what we do. But I told him, look, I love people and I love science, and I think that this is the way that I want to serve. And he said, son, you have a real gift for communicating, and I hope that someday you might consider running for office. And I couldn't help it, but the first thing that came to my mind was, I don't know if you saw my first name, but there are 11 letters in that name, and that's just the first name. This is not in the cards for someone like me. He said, well, look, I understand, I get it. But I hope that someday you'll consider. And to explain why I'm ultimately doing this thing has everything to do with the life of a 3-year-old little boy whom I had the privilege of serving when I was health commissioner in the city of Detroit. His name was Marius. He was the 4th child of a 21-year-old mom, met his father probably about 4 times in his life because his dad's in jail. But before I tell you how I met Marius, I want to just share with you the context within which I met him. I grew up in a family that was built by Abdul ElSayed and Jackie Johnson, now Abdul ElSayed. And Abdul ElSayed is the eldest of 6, born to a vegetable salesman and the smartest, wisest woman I've ever met in my life, who was my grandmother Suad, who never got to spend a day in school. She was illiterate. They raised their 6 kids of the 8 that she gave birth to in a 1-bedroom apartment overlooking the fish market where my grandfather sold vegetables every day. And my dad knew that if he was going to walk a path that was any different than the one that his father had walked, that he was going to have to build that path for himself with an education. And by all means, he did. He had the opportunity when he finally graduated from his undergraduate program in engineering to pick one of 2 places that he was going to immigrate to. It was either going to be Bayreuth, Germany, or Detroit, Michigan. And my dad has an affinity for the sound Reut, it seems. But the only 2 similarities between Detroit and Bayreuth is that they're both places where people make cars, and they both end in the sound Reut. And so my dad was somebody who did his homework, and when he did his homework, he learned about a Detroit that was in the United States of America. And he made the decision to come to this country because of the ideals upon which the country was founded. Now, my stepmother, who raised me from the age of 3, could not come from different circumstances. She was born and raised in a place called Gratiot County, Michigan. So you're going to pardon my Michiganness here, but Gratiot County's just here. And her family has been in this part of the world since before the Revolutionary War. She can draw her lineage to Abigail Adams, which is just funny because my younger brother's name is Osama, so he's like the only blue blood Osama in the world. And so I got to grow up in this incredible multi-ethnic, multi-faith, multi-context family. And my summers would have me getting on an airplane, going off to Alexandria, Egypt, where I'd hang out with my grandparents, aunts and uncles and cousins. And then I'd come back in the middle of the summer to a place called Montcalm County, where my family has had a cottage on a lake for the past 90 years. And I'd hang out with the other side of my grandparents, aunts and uncles and cousins, and came to appreciate some things. When your grandmother kisses you on the forehead, or tells you you should eat a little bit more, or calls you an idiot, it's with the same love, regardless if it's your grandmother who raised 6 kids, never got to go to school in Alexandria, Egypt, or your grandmother who raised 3 kids and is a nurse in Gratiot County, Michigan. And came to appreciate that the things that make us human, that bind us in who we are, tend to be far bigger than the things that differentiate us, despite the fact that if you were to introduce my grandmother Suad to my grandmother Judy and share with them the fact that they share a grandchild, that would have blown their minds. And that's the blessing of having grown up in this country. Now, my father grew up in a market, and so he has this real affinity for outdoor markets, and there's this incredible market called the Eastern Market in Detroit. Anybody ever been there before? All right, so if you ever go to Detroit, tell him I sent you. You got to go over there. There's the guy who sells mushrooms, the kind that you eat, and they're fantastic. And so we used to drive from the suburb just north of Detroit into the city of Detroit most Saturdays. And one of the things that struck me during my childhood, I think when you're the most perceptive about the world, is that the difference in life opportunities and expectations that we would drive in that 30 minutes was the same as it would take me 8 hours to cross when I'd go off to Alexandria. And that, to me, was the framing for everything I was interested in throughout my education. Why is it that you can travel 30 minutes and 10 years difference in life expectancy in these United States of America? So I knew that I loved people, and my parents are both engineers, so I knew I loved science, and I thought I wanted to do something about that chasm, that 30-minute, 10-year life expectancy chasm. And that ultimately led to the opportunity to study biology and politics at the University of Michigan. I went off to Oxford, I was a Rhodes Scholar, and did a PhD in public health, and then went to medical school. And in my last year of medical school, I came to appreciate that the clinical world that I had thought I wanted to inhabit was not going to be the one that was going to equip me with the set of tools to be able to solve that difference. Studying biology and politics, one of the more interesting things that you come to appreciate is that actually these systems are quite similar. If biology is a set of rules by which our cells make complex decisions about scarce resources in our bodies, politics is just a set of rules by which our communities make complex decisions about scarce resources in society. And if you want to understand why people get sick, we spend a lot of time focused on the biology, the odd decisions that cells sometimes make. But we don't focus as much on the odd decisions that communities sometimes make, and the ways in which those decisions ultimately pattern access to all of the means of health and disease. A good job that pays a living wage, that puts a good roof over someone's head, puts clean air in their lungs, clean water in their cups, allows them to walk in their communities without being victimized by either a neighbor or the state itself. Those are the things that ultimately pattern health and disease. That is what differentiates the experience that I got to grow up in from the experience that so many live in the city of Detroit. And so I spent the first couple of years of my career as an academic doing research around trying to understand how we think about policy relevant to health disparities, and realized pretty quickly that most of the people around me were a lot smarter than I was, and that my best skill set was probably more navigating the bureaucracy, which a lot of my academic friends found so difficult, but that seemed so much more native to me, and realized that it was probably my curtain call on an academic career. And I knew that I wanted to be about solving hands-on that chasm. And so I got that opportunity when, by happenstance, a friend of mine started working with the mayor of Detroit. And I had called him up. We were planning to do lunch. And on a whim, I brought a couple of CVs. 2 weeks later, I'm having a conversation with the mayor of Detroit about public health in Detroit. And a month later, I'm walking in to the Detroit Health Department as health commissioner to rebuild a health department that had been shut down. Now, let me tell you the story of public health in Detroit. Detroit first had a health department beginning in 1827. And in 2012, the city went bankrupt, and they made the decision to shut down their 185-year-old health department. This in a city with a higher infant mortality rate than my father's native Egypt. In a city where our children face triple the probability of being hospitalized for asthma, quadruple the probability of being exposed to lead than the state average. They shut down their health department. I was hired in 2015 to rebuild that health department. Now, I didn't quite appreciate what I was walking into. When we started, we had 5 city employees and 85 contractors in the back of the building in Detroit where people go to pay their parking tickets. So, first day of work, I know I look a little bit young, and at that point I was 30 years old. So, I grew my beard out a little bit more. I put on my big boy suit and my big boy tie. I'm walking in first day. You're the commissioner. You're going to commission. Nobody ever tells you what that means, but you're going to do it anyway. And this guy walks up to me from the right. Hey, you work here? And I looked at him for a minute. I was like, all right, you're the commissioner. Yes, I do work here. He's like, great. Can you take my parking ticket in for me? I was like, no, sir, I'm the health commissioner. He looks at me for a minute. He's like, why are you walking into the parking building? And I look at him. I was like, you know what? I'm actually asking myself the same question. So we got his ticket paid. Problem solved. First 3 weeks of work, you've got to imagine the circumstance that I'm in. My job is ostensibly to provide basic public health goods and services for 700,000 people who have been systematically marginalized by every single level of government intended to serve them. And I didn't even know where to begin. I knew everything I could know about the theory of public health. I'd gone to 2 different graduate schools to learn what public health is, and I still didn't have an operational definition that would actually help me to do my job. And that's when I got to meet Marius. So Marius, I met him when I was touring our vaccination clinic. And this kid walks in with about as much charisma as you can imagine, right? This 3-year-old little kid just got this saunter, this swagger about himself. I'm just like, this kid, I need some of that. And he just had these big brown eyes and just this personality that lit up the room. And when his mom figured out who I was and introduced me to him, I've been introduced to a fair number of 3-year-olds. And usually the way it goes is that the parent will say, hey, meet this person. And the 3-year-old will look at you just enough to realize they don't know who you are, and then bury their face back in their parent, right? Kid didn't do that. Looks me right in the eye, shakes my hand, gives me a hug, walks back to his mom. I just look at this kid, I was like, this kid is either the most rational or the most confident 3-year-old I've ever met in my life. And in that moment, I couldn't help but contrast his confidence to the set of circumstances in which he's living. I already told you about the public health statistics, but just probabilistically, if this kid graduates from his decrepit, underfunded public school system in the city of Detroit, his probability of winding up in jail remains statistically higher than it does of winding up in college. And I realized that for me, the definition of public health that mattered most was that which gave this child a justification for the kind of confidence that he and any other child of his age should have in the life that he or she is going to live. That is the work of government fundamentally, is that we have to be about justifying that kind of confidence, that kind of swagger, that kind of belief in yourself and the world in which you live, that you, in fact, if you do your work, will have access to the kinds of opportunities that you deserve. And that's what led us to thinking about our health department and setting ourselves a vision and a thesis for how it was that we were going to rebuild this department. We rebuilt Detroit's health department around the goal of leveraging health to disrupt intergenerational poverty. Because if you think about what the epidemic of poverty is, that boy is patient zero. And if we're not optimizing around his experience and the experiences of the people that make his life what it is, then we're missing the point entirely. So often in government, it's easy to think in abstract, to talk about tackling one problem or the other without actually optimizing around the lived experience of the people who we are intended to serve. And so for us, we identified a set of critical outcomes that we saw as being a part of the cycle of poverty. Teen pregnancy. 16% of all births in the city of Detroit are unintended to a teen mother. And if a young woman gets pregnant without intending to before graduating high school, her probability of dropping out is about 50%, 1 in 2. Infant mortality. Our infant mortality rate in the city of Detroit is higher than my father's native Egypt. It is the highest of any big city in the country. And we set our goal to address infant mortality because if a child is in a position where the probability of death is high, that kid already starts their life behind everyone else. Lead poisoning. We all know the biophysics of lead and what it does to a young, developing mind. And so it doesn't matter what you do around the investment if you've already poisoned that mind and its ability to move and leverage and make sense of information and knowledge. Vision deficits. If you can't see what's happening on the school board, it doesn't matter what's happening on the school board. Asthma. A child with persistent asthma is likely to miss a day of school every 2 weeks. Any sort of persistent asthma. And if you're talking about moderate to severe persistent asthma, you're talking about a day every week. Imagine trying to learn when you're missing a day every week because you can't breathe. And instead of spending a day in the classroom, you're spending a day in the emergency room. Misnutrition. We find this brutal paradox among low-income children, disproportionately children of color in communities like Detroit, where they have too much of the macronutrients that build a gut and too few of the micronutrients that build a brain. And so it's not even that it's just malnutrition, it's about the wrong nutrition, it's misnutrition. And then finally, elderly isolation. And one would say, well, if you're focused on children, why elderly isolation? Well, the single best thing you can do for a young person is give them access to an older person who cares about their life. And too many of our seniors in places like Detroit fundamentally can't get around because of the way that we've built our city. And I want to share with you just 4 of the projects that we kicked off to try and disrupt this cycle of intergenerational poverty, to break down the barriers that kids like Marius had to being able to learn and earn in Detroit like we would want for any child anywhere. We did, around infant mortality, we built a program called Sister Friends, with the idea that so many women who are carrying for the first time don't have high quality mentorship and are not connected to the resources that do exist. And a lot of that has to do with the brutal geography of the city of Detroit. So much of the attention is paid to 8 square miles of 138, and so many of the people live in those other 130. And so folks don't have access to those kinds of resources, both as a function of knowledge and also as a function of geography. And so if you're able to equip a young woman who's caring for the first time with access to a mentor who's not going to judge her and is able to empower her just by being there, and also because that person can connect her to the resources that exist in the city, then you have a chance at being able to reduce the probability of preterm birth and ultimately infant mortality. Around teen pregnancy, we know that so much of the unwanted pregnancy burden in Detroit is a function of lack of access to very basic preconception family planning services. We have one Planned Parenthood clinic serving 700,000 people in the city of Detroit, and it's right in Midtown. You guys familiar with Shinola Watches? It's walking distance from Shinola. And so you think about where the burden, right, of need is, and we're not serving that burden. So what we wanted to do was provide access to preconception family planning services in the neighborhoods in which young women live, learn, pray, and play. And so we wanted to put them in contexts that were discrete, that were not going to be stigmatized. So for example, if you were able to put such a clinic in a rec center, it's possible that a young woman could just as easily be walking in to have a conversation about controlling her fertility as she could to be playing basketball. And so we wanted to provide these services in the places that people actually are. When it came to asthma, so much of the burden of asthma in Detroit is driven by the poor quality of air that we have in a highly industrial city. Corporations that pollute have had their way with both state and city government for the past several decades. We built an environmental justice practice to stand up against these polluters. When Marathon Petroleum, that has a refinery in Southwest Detroit, the most polluted zip code in Detroit and in the state of Michigan, we were able to organize with the local community. The Michigan Department of Environmental Quality, who is supposed to regulate on these issues, was set to okay the deal. And we organized and we stood up. And together, the voice of the community was able to force Marathon Petroleum to reduce their emissions when they had wanted to increase them, investing $10 million to clean up their act. We did the same thing when it came to uncovered piles of petroleum coke on the Detroit riverfront. We were able to force that operator to cover their piles up if they wanted to store these piles that release fugitive dust and ultimately get into the lungs of our children. When it came to the issue of water and lead poisoning, we had built a program called Lead Safe Detroit. Now, let me tell you what Lead Safe Detroit was. We were in a situation where so many of our kids that had been tested positive for lead poisoning would fall through the cracks. We weren't able to move all of the goods and services that we could offer these kids to these kids because there was no system of actually managing the cases. And so we would convene a meeting every month where we would sit with all of the agencies that touch lead together and case manage every single case of lead poisoning to make sure that every child had access to everything that they needed. But there were circumstances that reminded us that we weren't doing enough to prevent in the first place. And so I had just finished inspecting city schools when I heard about the Flint water crisis. Our teachers in Detroit, some of the most courageous public servants you can talk about, who are doing the impossible every day in communities where they are under-resourced and without the means of being able to just basically do their job, they had conducted a sick-out because their buildings were not meeting code. And so as a city, we inspected every single school in the school district. I personally inspected a couple of them. Now, I want you to imagine with me this. Imagine you're walking into a first grade classroom. It's 11 a.m. It's about February 1st. And the first thing that you see is a first grader wearing their coats. It's 11 a.m. And the minute you walk into the room, you feel the chill, kind of like when you walk outside. And you realize that those kids go to school in that circumstance almost every single day because the boilers in their buildings don't work. And then you start looking around the room, and you see in the corner a dead mouse. Now, not just any dead mouse. The mouse didn't just die. The mouse is literally in a state of decay, suggesting it's been there for days. And then you walk out of that classroom, and you're walking by the gym, and you smell the smell of mold, and you look inside, and you see the gym floor buckling because of the amount of mold growing underneath that floor. These are the circumstances in which kids go to school in Detroit. And we realized that given those circumstances, it was possible that our kids could be exposed to the same lead we were hearing about in Flint in the single place where we systematically concentrate most of our kids, most of the day, most of the year. And so we put together a protocol to have every single school, daycare, and Head Start tested for lead in the water, tested all 360 buildings in 6 months, and created a protocol that is now model practice nationwide. Now, you think about the circumstances of a life. And I shared with you some of the work that we did at the health department. And if our goal is to tackle this epidemic of poverty, then focusing on health is certainly one approach to doing that. But you and I well know that the responsibility of addressing poverty goes well beyond the kinds of things that you can do in a health department. And I came to appreciate that, and frankly, the hard roof of being able to work as a public servant in appointed office when I took on my mayor on issues that he didn't want to pay attention to. The city of Detroit shuts down 18,000 homes from having water every single year. Now, it shouldn't, I don't know how many of you all are public health people or doctors, but you all would probably agree with me that something that comprises 70% of your body, the lack thereof is probably a public health issue, right? It seems like it should make sense. And the city didn't want to move on it because it didn't make financial sense. And so we're raising the cost of water on people without being able to actually empower them to pay their bills, and they face shutoffs. I came to appreciate how serious that was when I was personally visiting a house where a woman had lost a baby. And I asked her if I could use her restroom, and I went to use the restroom only to appreciate that there was no water in the restroom. Instead, there were a couple of bottles lined up next to the sink. And I saw the baby bath and the bottles lined up to the baby bath. And I asked her, you don't have water, do you? She said, no. I said, how long haven't you had water? She said, a couple months. Imagine trying to bathe your child with bottled water because you don't have water in your house, because you're paying hundreds of dollars a month simply to pay for something that frankly should be a human right. These are the circumstances in a place like Detroit. And if you don't pay attention to that, there's no way you're going to interrupt real poverty. And then you have challenges relating to housing in the city. Our biggest monument program in the city of Detroit was a demolitions program. The idea being that if you demolish homes that are no longer being used, that'll raise the value of all the other homes. And in theory, it works. Here's the problem, though. If you're demolishing housing that was built before 1978, the probability that there is lead in the walls is 100%. And if you don't take precautions around how you do this, around following the kind of protocol that will protect from fugitive dust, there's a high probability that you're going to release a cloud of lead dust into the air. We did an analysis on this very issue. We found that the probability that a child who lived within 400 feet of a demolition, of that child testing positive, was about 30% higher. And if they lived within 200 feet, it was 60% higher. The dose-response relationship. It's about as good as you get in epidemiologic studies. And what was the mayor's response? Well, I need a third opinion. I was like, well, before I did this job for you, I literally did this kind of research. That was my job. And this kind of assessment, this kind of study, right? It's about as ironclad as you get. And no attention paid because it wasn't politically feasible. And so in that moment, I came to very much appreciate that the responsibility of tackling the kind of poverty that we wanted to address, the epidemic of poverty, required us to be able to set the agenda around the circumstances in which that little boy lives. I want you to think about his user experience for a second. I want you to think about his life. Put yourself in his shoes, and he's walking through his life. He lives in a home that was built before 1978 that his mother rents from a predatory landlord. He pays the same kinds of rates that people like me paid in downtown Detroit simply because they prey off the fact that a lot of those other folks, because of credit score, can't compete for that kind of housing. In Detroit, if you own your home, there's a 36% probability that you are going to lose that home, not to mortgage foreclosure, but to tax foreclosure. Why? Because we're assessing homes at about 50% plus the rate of the value of the home. Imagine having to pay 50% of the value of your home every year in taxes. 36% default, and they're kicked out of their homes. And then you think about the circumstances of his mother's work. She works 2 jobs just to be able to pay a basic income to be able to put good food on the table for her kids. 2 jobs. Why? Because you can't actually afford the cost of that rental and the cost of that food on minimum wage working 40 hours a week. You think about his grandmother who provides most of the child care. Well, she has Medicaid and Medicare, but the problem is that the way that we incentivize doctors means that there aren't doctors in the community in which she lives. And there's questionably reliable public transportation. You have to wait about an hour to take a bus. And for her to get to the nearest clinic that would see her for her heart failure, she'd have to take 2 buses. That means 1 transfer. That means the whole trip's gonna take her 2.5 hours, and she's got 4 kids to care for. So instead, she winds up in and out of the hospital because she exacerbates every month. You think about that boy's father. Man's in jail, 3rd time. Never even accused of a violent crime. We incarcerate 11% more people in the state of Michigan than the national average. We have a system of policing that seems to want to police on top of people rather than police with people. We're way better at violating people's bodies for petty crime than we are in policing the violations of their bodies for serious crime. The probability of closing a murder in Detroit is extremely low. And yet, the cops will pick on you just because you look a particular kind of way. And then you think about the air that boy breathes, and it's polluted by folks like Marathon. You think about the water he may or may not have in his house. You think about the school district he's gonna go to that's been under receivership from the state for the past 7 years, that has proceeded, despite only having to do the work of reducing that debt, has doubled the debt over the past 7 years. And meanwhile, you have a corporate system of charter schools that have eaten up the children from public schools. And so those public schools are hemorrhaging to these for-profit corporations that take our tax dollars and put them in their back pocket. Thank you, Betsy DeVos. You think about the fact that we don't have reliable mass transportation in Detroit anywhere, and if you have a car, the probability is in Detroit, because we have a legal system of redlining, that you're gonna pay upwards of $500 to $1,000 a month just for your car insurance. So 50% of Detroiters do what's called driving dirty, meaning that they don't have insurance. So that forces you to do something illegal simply because if you're black or you live in a particular zip code or you haven't completed high school or your credit score is below 600, well, you're gonna pay a lot more for your car insurance. The tragic irony of the Motor City is that about 25% of Detroiters don't have a car in a city that was built around the car. And so to be able to address the circumstances of that boy's life, if we are honest about trying to actually address this epidemic of poverty, it forces us to pay attention to those issues. Our campaign just put out a 45-page urban agenda. And in that agenda, we're talking about how it is that we solve that foreclosure epidemic in the city of Detroit, how it is that we create something as simple as a renter's bill of rights. We're talking about the fact that water, the basic amount that a family of 4 needs to be able to drink, to clean, to cook, and to bathe, should be a right. It should be free. We're talking about how it is that we actually incentivize real mass transit, and we bar the predatory auto insurance industry from being able to charge differentially based on where you live or based on what your education level is. We're talking about what it means to actually build a Michigan Department of Environmental Quality that's focused on environmental justice as an end, rather than being run by a former oil executive as it is today. We're talking about real criminal justice reform, policing with communities rather than upon communities, making sure that the leadership of our police is not somebody who calls people who are peacefully protesting, young black men, just for taking a knee, calling them degenerates and ungrateful. People who represent the communities that they are meant to police and have experience in those communities, where we're not throwing the book at people simply for possessing a drug that ought to be legal in the first place. Where if you go to jail, that jail is going to be a place where you're going to get access to the education that we failed to give you when you were in our public school system. And that once you get out, people aren't gonna ask about your experience of having been in jail. We're talking about being able to build the kind of Michigan where we are empowering people like that little boy to be the means of growth in the first place. that has to be the way that we tackle this epidemic of poverty. Systems matter. Oftentimes, politicians like me will stand up and just give you a bunch of issues. Systems matter. They reinforce themselves and they are directed in particular directions. And if we're not willing to direct our system of how we govern in a place like Michigan around empowering that little boy to be the means of what the future looks like, then we're failing him and we're failing ourselves. And that is the focus of how we ought to be able to move policy that actually does address this epidemic of poverty. Now, I want to end on a couple of notes. Recently, Amazon, that big corporation that we all, click and save, Amazon announced that they wanted to have a second headquarters, and there's this big sweepstakes about where they were going to go. And the city of Detroit and also the city of Grand Rapids both put in proposals. And neither Detroit nor Grand Rapids made their top 20 list. And everybody in Michigan was really upset about this whole thing. Here's the problem. I think we're asking the wrong question, right? The question should not be, why does Amazon choose not to come to Detroit? The question has to be, how do we empower people like that little boy, Marius, to be the people who start the Amazons of the future in Detroit in the first place? Because unless we're willing to invest in people and the places in which they live, learn, work, and play, then we're missing the point about what it means to grow the kind of just, equitable, sustainable future that we want for a state like Michigan. I'll also say this. Politics is very personal. And anybody who tells you otherwise either has the privilege of never having to have been locked out or doesn't have the empathy to appreciate what that might feel like. Politics is deeply personal. And for me, I just recently had a reminder of just how personal it is. My partner, Sarah, about 10 weeks ago gave birth to our first baby girl. And this little girl is going to be this ethnically half Egyptian, ethnically half Indian, 100% American, Muslim, soon to be woman, sooner than I'd like to admit. And I think about the world that she's growing up in. Every night I get to come home and I get to put her to sleep. And in that moment, I get to look into her eyes and I feel things. And the things that I want to feel are the assuredness that the world in which I'm raising her is a world that is going to support her like I hope to support her, to empower her like I hope to empower her, to love her like I hope to love her. And I don't feel that. And so many people don't feel that right now. But I can't help but contrast my little girl, Emily, to Marius and my experience putting my little girl to sleep every night to what Marius's mom must feel when she walks in and sees him sleeping. And the work that we have to do comes down to whether or not we are willing to live our aspirations. Now, I told you about my dad at the outset. My dad is somebody who does his homework, and he learned about a society built on a set of ideals. And I had those ideals very vividly illustrated in my mind by my public school civics teacher. There's a woman named Miss Rayburn. She had this rare gift among educators. She was the kind of person who could go into your mind and put together a set of concepts. It was as if you were just there. And I remember feeling like I was with the framers of the Constitution when they made a decision to make our society about ideals instead of identities. And among those ideals is the one that I know my dad took a bet on back in 1978 when he chose to come here. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all people are created equal. And in that world, should we choose to reach out and grasp that aspiration, that world is the world where my daughter has no obstacles, but even more important than that, that boy, Marius, has no obstacles either. And we have to ask ourselves how far we are away from that world and whether or not we're willing to do the work of getting there. Now, the work of getting there will require us, yes, to have smart policy solutions, fine. But more importantly, it will require us to stand up to the institutions that have created the world as it stands in the first place. The thing about politics is that it doesn't really exist without conflict. So many people want a politics where you're not actually standing up against anything. Everybody kind of agrees. Well, in rooms like this, we all kind of can agree because by definition, we're the people who've won. Now the question becomes, are we willing to stand up on a set of things and against a set of others? Are we willing to have conversations that say, no, you can't actually close the door on certain kinds of people. You cannot erect the kind of institutions that hold people down. You cannot continue to eat at a particular corporate trough if you want to actually serve the public. Are we willing to call that out? Are we willing to have the courage of a set of convictions about the aspirations that are supposed to animate our society in the first place? That's not to say that we can't aspire to a world where we all get there, but that getting there means that the folks who say that certain people don't belong and certain people can't be a part of the solution and certain people can't be a part of the world we want to build, well, those folks, they have to be sidelined. And it means being willing to do the work of saying those ideas are broken, they don't work anymore. Now, I'll tell you, I've always believed that light drives out darkness. It's the only thing that can. And the thing about light is usually it's the willingness to just be in a moment where it's hard to be. And one of the things I've come to appreciate is that so many of the people who have been told that the circumstances in which they live are a function of others, right? So many of those folks, when you sit down and you're willing to actually be with them, and you're willing to hold a conversation with them, you're willing to dignify them for real people, you're willing to appreciate the pain that they have, and you're willing to articulate a future that says that actually when we come together as people who have been locked out in different ways for different reasons, when we come together around a politics that brings us together, that in fact the world can be the kind of place where all of us succeed, all of our children have the kind of future we would dream of for them. And that's going to mean being willing to take on institutions and to ask ourselves what role we play in perpetuating institutions and what role we can play standing against institutions when they're wrong. The thing about institutions is that they're usually populated with good people, right? Almost everybody in institutions is a good guy, good person. They don't mean wrong. The problem is that the institution enforces a certain way forward. And so for us, it's about coming together and standing up within the institutions that we live in and deciding that we won't just be validated by whether or not those institutions tell us that we're good and give us gold stars, but that we're willing to stand up on a set of ideals and values that we believe in to drive the institutions in the directions that they need to go. And I know one thing about this country, is that the people here, we have a unique capacity to correct. See, the thing about the idea of a more perfect union is it implies two mutually exclusive ideals at the same time, which is just so fundamentally human. A, that you're not perfect to begin with, because otherwise you couldn't be more perfect. But B, that you aspire to perfection even still. And so, in a moment like this, where the politics look so broken and we are so frustrated, I believe that if we're willing to aspire to that thing, we're willing to have conversations with the people who animate institutions, we're willing to ask ourselves what our ideals really are and what they imply for who we ought to be, we're willing to stand firm on those ideals, we're willing to grab hands with unlikely partners, and we're willing to walk forward, that world of ours, that more perfect union, that we can get there. And I look forward to partnership as we walk that path together. Thank you.
I wish I lived in Michigan. So we have, I think, about 15 minutes for questions. So I'd encourage you to come up to the mic, tell us who you are, and state your question. And thank you very much.
My name is Ned Bacon. Thank you so much for really an inspirational speech, and I commend you for your ability to tell stories that make all this very real. I've worked in institutions, I've worked in businesses, and I'm sure you've encountered the same problem, which is that whether it's Harvard or whether it's a big corporation, the need for resources always seems to exceed the resources that are available. And I like the discussion of ideals. How do you get the resources in place? Because these problems you've described are so big and so broad, and there's a need. So how do you address that problem?
Yeah, thank you for the question. One of the first things I was ever told about a budget is that it is a manifestation of your ideals and your values, right? Because your ideals mean nothing in infinite resource space. You can do anything, right? But the question becomes, when your resources are finite, what do you spend those resources on and why? And I do agree that we have deep resource constraints, but we also have deep resource constraints within the context of the ideals that we've already sort of seemed to baked in to what we spend our money on. So we live in a country right now where we spend 46% of the world's military expenditure, the world's expenditure. And I get it. It is a hard knock world out there. And yes, you have to defend yourself. But 46% of the world's military expenditure. And when people talk about things like universal health care, they say, well, it's going to be so expensive. So yeah, it is going to be kind of expensive. But the question becomes, is it what we're willing to spend our money on vis-a-vis all of the other things we already spend our money on? And I think the responsibility, obviously, is to be working towards situations where your solutions are non-zero sum, where you can actually generate more out of what you choose to do. But I will also say that it's going to mean making hard decisions about the things that we already spend on and why. And this is what I meant when I said that it means standing up against certain things. And I wish we could have everything and have our cake and eat it too, but that's not the world that we live in. And the world we live in is one where we have to toggle against different viewpoints and different perspectives on what is of value. And we have to ask ourselves whether or not what we spend is consistent with what our values purportedly are. And then we have to be willing to do the work of elevating the people who speak on behalf of alternative viewpoints, right? I mean, I'm here talking to you today. I really wish you could just meet Marius. I wish he could be here talking for himself. Because if he was, the question of whether or not he's worth it, the investments are worth it, I think that'd be answered. And I think that's what we have to be about doing, right? Places like this in particular are uniquely good about shaping the kind of conversation that we have, about dictating what is of value and what is important. And when we marginalize people like Marius and the people who live in communities like his all over the country, I mean, this could just as easily be Roxbury, right? It's a lot easier to continue to make decisions as we continue to make them. And I want us to have a conversation where we are shedding light on what the alternative uses of our money look like and what the fallacies of the current uses of our money look like.
Amelia Cohen, you laid out an inspiring program, an inspiring electoral proposal, basically. So my question is, I have two concerns. And one is that your program is somewhat narrowly urban-oriented, and also it has a narrow class basis. So what is the demographic situation? Because you're running for governor of Michigan, right? Yeah. So I wonder how I assume you've thought that through, but you haven't addressed it. And the other is, how are you going to realize this ambitious, very humane program, given the federal context in which you'll be working?
Yeah, thank you for your question. I really appreciate it. So I focused today on what was ultimately our urban agenda. We will be rolling out a rural agenda in the next 3 weeks. And the reason I chose to focus on the urban agenda today is because it comes out of my work in Detroit and is educated by that experience. I'll tell you this, though. I took a bet on the fact that this kinds of challenges that people in urban communities and people in rural communities face tend to actually be more similar than we're allowed to see. And that inability to look beyond the curtain has been driven in large part by the goals and the agendas of politicians who benefit tremendously from dividing these two groups of people. I'll also say that when you talk to folks who don't suffer that kind of poverty, one of the big challenges that many of us face is, why has the world become so insecure? And there's a lot of conversation about neopopulism in this moment. And a lot of that is driven by the manifestations of stories told to people about why they no longer have what they used to have. Yeah. And then the question becomes, well, what do we do to make sure that people don't lack access to those things in the future? It's easy, I think, in this moment of time where we get hyper-segregated by race, certainly, but also by socioeconomic position, to assume that the lives that others lead have no implication for our own. And I think that's a very dangerous assumption. It's a dangerous assumption because it hurts people, but it's also a dangerous assumption because it's just fundamentally not true. We all live in the same world. And when I speak on the coasts sometimes about the situation in the middle of the country, I often get very well-meaning questions about, well, why did people go for Trump? I'll tell you, my own uncle voted for Donald Trump. And this is a guy who drove truck his whole life. And he was somebody who, I'll tell you, he was most fun uncle. He was the guy who took us snowmobiling in the winters, took us water skiing in the summers, introduced me to a mustard pretzel, which if you've never had one is delicious. And went as far as to learn how to prepare venison halal so that my family could eat it. He's not motivated by any anti-Muslim animus at all. But he lost his business in 2008 when the economy went bust. He was told by the Democratic establishment that the economy is back. Well, it's back if you're a trader on Wall Street. It's not back if you're my uncle in the middle of the state of Michigan. And so for him, he felt like he was between somebody who was kind of crazy but was speaking right to him and somebody who seemed not to care about people like him at all. And he made what was within the boundedness of his information a pretty rational decision. You got to imagine I was quite surprised, right? And I confronted him about it. I'll never forget what he said. You vote in your best interest and I vote in mine. And it's time for us to be able to have a conversation across these bounds about what drives people's decision-making and about the facts and realities of those lives. Because if we don't pay attention to them, right, we risk not only tearing apart our social fabric, but allowing people to live in unnecessary suffering, the kind of suffering that we could solve if we're willing to get it right about where we allocate our funding.
Hi, my name is Nikhil Patel. I'm actually a student here at the business school, and coincidentally, I'm also actually going to go work in Detroit this summer in the mayor's office. So it's exciting and encouraging to hear this. My question to you is regarding your comment about Amazon. So you mentioned how there's a state of the world where you invest in making it so that in Detroit, there could be the next Amazon. If you were governor, how would you balance that versus the very real possibility that cities like Boston or San Francisco or even Austin already have business momentum? And if we take too long to build that business momentum in Detroit or even in the state of Michigan, then you're going to lose that battle over and over. So how would you prioritize getting companies to come first and then investing, or the other way around?
It's a great question. I'll tell you this, right? All three of those cities that you named, they have a really strong startup culture, right? And if you're a startup, you want two things. You want talent and capital. Agreed? Here's the problem. In Michigan, we have played by an economic script that says that we actually have no capacity to generate our own businesses, organic growing businesses. And so the best thing that we can do is provide ridiculous tax subsidies to huge corporations to come and bring jobs that we know are going to get offshored or automated within the next 5 years anyway. And then when those jobs that we promised go away and they're still getting subsidized, well, we've got to go back to the drawing board. So what do? We do the same thing again. And then you're left in a circumstance where you no longer have the revenue to be able to invest in people and infrastructure. And you have a couple of corporations that run highly automated factories in random parts of your state. What's lost is the ability to actually attract talent and capital. So to me, I would much rather start investing in our talent and our infrastructure, which if you talk to any business leader in the world, they will tell you the things that I want are highly talented skill set and skilled workforce and really great infrastructure that's not going to let me down. You do those things, I'm a lot more interested in coming to where you are. And right now, we're so beholden to our dependency on these huge corporations, and we're so at a loss for the ability to actually invest in people and infrastructure that we're stuck doing the same thing over again. You see what I mean? And so, part of the question is like, well, if you're losing the game, do you just give up? Or do you just start playing the game better? Well, you start playing the game better. right? And so in Michigan, we have to start playing the game better. And that means to me a couple of things. Number one, it means really believing in our ability to build a small business, startup-oriented kind of economy. People want to come to Detroit if we're able to incentivize them to come. That means when they come, they know they're gonna have an awesome workforce and they've got great infrastructure. And infrastructure also means the kinds of things that you, as a young person who's making a decision about where you wanna build your life, the kind of lifestyle that you want, right? Unfortunately, in Michigan, almost all of the housing we have is single-family units, right, in random neighborhoods that young people don't really want to live in anymore, right? And so unless we're able to build around trying to attract the people who are going to build the economy of the future, and more importantly, invest in our people in Michigan, right? That little boy, so he's the kind of person who goes to college, stays in Michigan, builds a great startup that becomes a billion-dollar corporation. I'd love to see that. You see what I mean? And so it's about making those investments strategically now and recognizing that the short-term incentive sets that most politicians and most corporations are beholden to are only going to allow us to swirl further and further down the toilet bowl, right? And at some point, you got to rethink it. I was sitting with the Crane's Detroit Business Editorial Board, and they're like the business magazine for Detroit companies, and articulated this vision to them, and they're like, well, that's a 50-year vision. I was like, yeah. He's like, well, you're not gonna be able to accomplish it in 8 years. I was like, yeah, I agree. But the question to me has to be, how do I make the Michigan where my daughter chooses to raise her kids and her kids choose to raise their kids? Not, right, how do I make myself look good for 4 years, right? So everybody pats me on the back and then we're all right down where we were. We need leadership that's thinking on a 50-year to 100-year time horizon. That's what all leadership should be.
Thank you very much. This has been a refreshing talk. I guess my question as I think about this is, as I think as Frederick Douglass said, power never sees anything without a struggle, never has, never will. And it looks like the corporations and the people who want tax cuts for the rich and so forth really have a pretty loaded deck right now. So how can we help citizens who've been shamed, who feel like it's their fault that they're poor or they're not getting educated, to feel like they can unite and stand up to Citizens United?
Thank you for the question. The caustic influence that corporate money has had in our politics, I don't even think the full story has been told. Just as somebody running for office, I don't take corporate money. So even without taking corporate money, I know I'm going to be vastly outspent, both in the primary and the general, by people who do take that money. And I still spend 60% of my time raising money, right? And that just is a complete waste of time, honestly, complete waste of time. It's not going to make me any better because I spend 5 hours on the phone asking people for money, right? That's the state of running for office. It's a big reason why a lot of folks who are well qualified don't, because it sucks. And so the question becomes, how do we reverse that? I think a couple of things, right? Number one, we have to center those conversations. I thought the point that you made about Frederick Douglass's quote and power and struggle matters. We have to center the voices of people who suffer in the conversations that we have. And we have to recognize that the challenges that they face have nothing to do with circumstances of their own making. They have everything to do with structures that have created a very easy way for money to follow money, right? And we've allowed the biggest institutions in our society to not just corrupt our economics and create this kind of inequality, but corrupt our politics as well by being able to reach over and control, right, via access to money, the kinds of people who run. So aside from centering those voices, which I think is probably the most important thing, we also have to think, I think, systematically about how it operates, right? One of the frustrations that I've had with the way that Democrats have operated over the past several years is that we've forgotten that the real action is local, right? And everybody's focused on the presidency and federal elections, but we forget that real action is local. And I don't mean to make this partisan, so Republicans probably did the same thing. But they actually didn't. Republicans knew exactly where the action was. And so we're about 2 state legislatures away from the possibility for nationwide Republicans to host a constitutional convention and ratify changes in the Constitution. What do you think about that means? So focusing local is critical. gerrymandering is probably the most important local governance issue aside from money and politics. And I think there's been a lot of really great headway in the courts and a lot of really great headway that citizens groups have come together. In Michigan, there's a group called Voters Not Politicians. They got 400,000 signatures in the matter of like 3 months to get a ballot proposal on our 2018 ballot so that people can actually vote on bipartisan independent or nonpartisan independent redistricting, which is amazing. But those kinds of efforts matter a lot, and that's where this needs to be fought. And then in terms of money and politics, I also think that this is a local fight, right? Overturning Citizens United is a much hairier process at the federal level. But what we can do, right, is focus on state level legislation that at least sunshines, and if not sunshines, ideally gets that money out of politics. I'll tell you, in my race alone, any individual can spend $6,800 on the race. A couple can do $13,600, and a corporation can do $68,000, and that's all that's above board. That's not even including super PACs, right? And we just passed at the state level a policy proposal or a body of bills, now law, that they call Citizens United on steroids. That basically makes it state law in Michigan that there is no actual limitation on what a corporation can give to a super PAC through dark money and soft money means. But focusing locally to try and undo that or to block it where it happens, I think is critical. And then the final thing I'll say is get out and vote. I mean, this is the crazy thing about it, right? 30%, I mean, probably in this room, you're talking about most of you get out and vote, but 30% in any given election actually come out to vote. If everybody voted, politics in Michigan and in the United States would look substantially different. And the work of getting people out and getting them to the ballots, that matters. That's the only thing that does matter in the end, right? And I think a lot of the attention has to be paid around getting out the vote and getting communities out to vote, which also means thinking differently about the kinds of people who run, right? One of the things that's been really interesting in my race is that people don't usually run. And when I say like me, I mean like me in a lot of different ways. Young, ethnic minority, of religious minority, somebody who has professional skill set outside of law. Those folks don't run. And I think that we need to be empowering different kinds of candidates because they're able to speak to the electorate in different ways. And I think we'd start to see a lot more movement in that electorate when people actually see themselves in their politicians.
Hello, my name is Omar El-Hawagi. My parents are Egyptian immigrants, and I am a dual degree student here at the Harvard Kennedy School and the University of Michigan Law School.
Go blue.
Go blue. I want to thank you for your time. So many of us here on campus and across the country who are young Muslim Americans are looking up to you. And when we read articles like, Abdul El-Sayed, great guy, not so great name, many of us are left wondering how a person like you is both navigating both the media internally to Michigan and establishment politics in the state.
Yeah. I like my name. I'll tell you a funny story about how I became Abdul. So my whole name is actually Abdul Rahman, which is about as intimidating as it sounds in English. And my parents got divorced right after they had me and both remarried. And I was raised by my father and my stepmom. And 1989 rolls around, and I'm about to start kindergarten. And my stepmom looks at my dad and is like, this kid's not going to make it a day with that name. So they sort of cast about looking for a new thing. And turns out that 1989, in September, guess who's topping the charts? Straight Up Now, baby. It's Paula Abdul with Straight Up. And so at that point, they're like, this is his name. It's going to be Abdul from here on out. And I told you about my little brother Osama. My parents were, they didn't want to mess it up twice. So 8 years later, he's being born, and they're like, we're going to give him a really easy name. It's Sam with O on the front and A on the back. What could go wrong? So they're kind of 0 for 2 on boys' names at this point. My sister got Semya, which is a good name. And Osama's a good name too, and Abdurrahman is a good name too. But look, I've grown up with the rare privilege of being able to cross different worlds of experience pretty seamlessly just because of who my family was. And a lot of folks who either don't know Muslims or Muslims who haven't spent time outside of the Muslim community don't understand, like honestly, in their gut, don't understand how somebody like me could walk into a community where people haven't met Muslims and just have a conversation. Here's the thing about it though, you just do it. It's not that hard, right? And the thing about it is that as a Muslim community, we center so much the Muslim thing, and it becomes, we have antenna that pick up stories about it. And so it becomes the thing that we're all conscious about. And I've known enough because of my life growing up with my white American family that people don't care that much. They just don't. If you make it a thing, they're going to make it a thing. But if you don't, then they don't care. And I've found that Michiganders, they actually don't really care how you pray. They care what you pray for. And for me, I know what I pray for. I pray for my little girl. I pray for my wife. I pray for my family. Pray for my parents. I pray for the University of Michigan football team. Like, those are the things that I pray for. And those tend to be the things that most Michiganders pray for, if they know it's good for them. And so, I knew that if you're willing to stand in and have a conversation, not ignoring your faith, right, but also not making it about your faith, but just having a conversation about what you believe to be what's in the best interest of all of us, people are quite receptive. The interesting thing about it is that there are going to be some people who hate me because I'm Muslim. Trust me, I know about that. But they were never going to vote for a Democrat anyway. You know what I mean? And I'm not going to make my life decisions about who fears me out of their own bigotry, right? And for them, we don't respond to that. And the reason we don't respond is because for me, the best way to get back is to force them to deal with the cognitive dissonance of, after having 8 years of my leadership, that they have to deal with the fact that their life's actually a little bit better because of a guy named Abdul El-Sayed, right? And so, I think for a lot of us, in a moment like this, it's really easy to look at the barriers in front of us without paying as much attention to the opportunities in front of us. And, for whatever privilege that I have or don't have, right? Would this be easier if my name was, Andy Smith? Probably. But here's the thing. I also get to be the first person to do this. I mean, that's a real privilege. And I also know that for so many people who have never seen themselves in a politician, that I know what it was like to watch Barack Hussein Obama get elected and be like, that guy's kind of like me, right? He may or may not be Muslim. The funny thing is, if you ever want something to laugh at, if you go look at some of the sort of like alt-right, white supremacist blogs about me, they're like, he's like Barack Obama, but openly Muslim. but I was like, thank you for the comparison. I'll take it on every day. But pretty sure Barack Hussein Obama was not Muslim. Funny thing about it is Keith Ellison is Muslim, but they're like, yeah, his name's Keith. I mean, come on. So all of that is to say, there's a real responsibility, I think, to focus on what we can do rather than what we can't. And, in places of privilege, oftentimes, the underprivileged focus a lot on the lack of privilege, rather than recognizing that, in fact, privilege comes with responsibility. And the responsibility of being the first is that you do it, right? And if you're so focused on what's in front of you that stops you from doing it, you won't. I mean, you look back at, the crazy thing about this is that, you look back at the real leaders in our history. People like Martin Luther King. He was assassinated at 39. Everything he accomplished, he did before he was 40. And I'm pretty sure most of the time he didn't complain about why it was unfair. Why it was unfair was obvious, right? What he was focused on was what he was going to do to make it more fair for somebody who came after him, right? And I think for those of us, who feel sometimes locked out, right? The job is to unlock the door, right? I mean, obviously, that's the job. Don't sit there and be upset because the door's locked. You got the opportunity to be the one with the pick, so go pick it, right? Or the one with the shoulders, so go break down the door, right?
Thank you very much.
Hi, my name's Kim Gannon. I'm currently doing some public health, healthcare delivery research at MIT, recent graduate of Michigan State University, actually, so
right,
go green. Go white.
Go.
In the wake of things that have been going on at Michigan State University, the heartbreaking failure of the institution to address the Larry Nassar crisis, I'm really on board with the things you've been saying about standing firm with our ideals against institutions that have blatantly disregarded some of the most vulnerable people that they're charged with protecting and taking care of. Speaking to your public health record, you mentioned kind of the phrase like forming unlikely partnerships, which is actually a really big buzz phrase in public health. In fact, the Harvard Chan School of Public Health just hosted the Surgeon General, who used a similar phrase when he was talking about his prerogatives. So can you speak a little bit more to exactly, how maybe reaching out to an unlikely partner who may have a lot of disagreements in terms of other values, interests, maybe even political affiliations, and like, how do you identify those partners? How do you kind of incentivize like an alignment of values and laying out like, okay, this is valuable to you too, and really getting on the same page with that.
Thank you. So first, I just have to say that the massive failure at MSU. I hate to say it, it is one of the most heartbreaking things that I watched develop. And you think about the courage of those women to come up and to say their truth. I just think that we need more courage like that. And the other side of this that often gets missed in the conversation about MSU and frankly the conversation about the Me Too movement is the culpability and responsibility of men to reach out and to be a part of breaking down a culture of sexual violence and toxic masculinity that we've allowed to pervade our institutions and our culture for far too long now. And if this is not a wake-up call for men to stand up and to speak about these issues and to engage on these issues, I don't know what will be. And my hope is that men, as a function of the courage of women to stand up and call this what it is, will be willing to take this and do the work that they uniquely can do around being able to call this out everywhere we see it, right? And this concept of locker room talk, came out of the president's piss poor attempt to try and justify the things that he said about women. But locker room talk is a real thing. And if we're not willing to have a conversation with a young man who's talking about objectifying a woman, then the question becomes, did we enable something, right? And I think that's where the locus of the conversation needs to go. So about unlikely partnerships. One of the things that I think is really important for folks who aspire to leadership to remind themselves is that leadership is not just about finding the world as it is, it's about creating the world as you believe it should be, right? And oftentimes it means being very vocal and honest about the values that animate your work, and then watching as people will align to what you're talking about, right? Great political leadership is not just, we'll say effective political leadership, is not just about being able to find what people are talking about. It's about being able to dictate in some way what the conversation ought to be able to move forward. And I'll use a very bad example of this just to see how effective it was. Polling showed that immigration was not even on the top 10 list of issues going into the 2016 election. But the current person who is president now was able to make that an issue, right? Build a wall. It's a solution to a non-problem. But by making a solution to a non-problem, he turned it into a problem. Does that make sense? And we have to remind ourselves that as leaders, we have the ability to move the public conversation, not just to find the public conversation where it is. And what that means is that when people see you as being a credible believer in the things that you care about, they'll sometimes find you in ways that you wouldn't have expected. One of the things that I learned at the health department was exactly this. Was when we were trying to move on certain issues, we found that oftentimes some of the small business organizations in Southwest Detroit, when we were advocating against Marathon, they were our biggest supporters. Why? Because they have to live in that world where the air is so poisoned. They wouldn't be the natural partner, but because you're standing up on something, they're saying, that's an issue for me too. And I'm going to be a part of this. Even though traditionally they're saying, well, why are you regulating on business? Why are you telling a business what to do, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? And so I think it's about, more than anything else, believing in the values that you bring forward and the actions that those values necessitate, and then being willing to touch hands with people who sometimes might come out of the woodwork, right? And then the other thing about it is being willing to say that, there is no such thing as an enemy, right? There is a such thing as opposing the wrong action in a particular moment, right? And the willingness to say, we're going to be about values rather than being about traditional enemy versus friend alliances allows you then to be very thoughtful about being able to pick partnerships across the various things that you work on because you are credible on the issues that you care about. I think more than anything else, people look for partners that are firm on what they believe in, right? Because they don't want to be shown, for being unable to move the world the way they want to move it. So being able to say, this is what I believe in, this is how I believe in it, and this is how I'll fight for it, keep a big smile on my face, and we're going to move forward, you'll find that people come out of the woodwork and will want to work with you on things and in partnerships you never expect. And I think it's being firm on what you believe, driving forward on the actions that necessitates, and then being willing to partner with anybody and everybody who wants to get that thing done, recognizing that in the next iteration, you might not be partners, but hey, that's the world, right?
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Amanda Markovitz. I'm a doctoral student in epidemiology and a former Michigander.
All right. You want to come back? We need epidemiologists.
Yeah, I had a question. So, we talk a lot about the disconnect between science and politics, and I'm so glad that you're bridging that gap, and especially that you're talking about statistics in a way that reaches people, talking about these stories and anecdotes that really matter to people. And I wonder sort of if you have other lessons for us scientists that are trying to communicate with our communities, maybe not running for governor, but on a smaller level, in ways that we can do a better job.
Yeah. So first of all, do it. A lot of scientists, the incentives that exist in academia sometimes preclude well-meaning scientists who want their work to move the public conversation from doing it because it's not what's rewarded. And I honestly think that's a big problem with academia and one of the things we all need to fix, right? Let's be clear. If your work is not actually moving the public conversation, then what's it moving? Especially in epi, especially when so much of what we do is about misaligned actions of institutions, right? So be the courageous one in the institution who communicates, who gets your work out there. Don't just write the paper, write the op-ed, right? That's number one. Number two, oftentimes the thing about the difference in the ways that scientists communicate versus policy people communicate allow the conversations to miss each other in the air. So scientists always ask, what's not known, right? That's the question. What's not known, and then how do I get to making a known out of an unknown, right? That's like the push for science. Policy people aren't asking what's not known. They're asking, what are the implications of what is known for what I can do right now? Do you see what I mean? And I think it's on both of them to be able to translate well, right? Because most of the time, if you have a policy person who's not trained in science, they're always asking why the scientist keeps putting caveats behind what they're saying, right? Because most science would be like, this is my work suggests, and this is like last paragraph of every paper, right? This work suggests that opportunities for future research look like this, right? You're like, no, what does this mean for the world, right? And a lot of scientists will always caveat what they tell you they think should happen based on the best, most rigorous work out there, right? And if scientists themselves who are doing the best, most rigorous work aren't willing to give you a firm answer, then at some point you're like, meh, nobody knows anything, right? I'm serious. And so part of what scientists need to be able to do is speak like policy people do, which is to say, of the current opportunity sets that exist, this is the one that would create X outcome that you are interested in maximizing, dear policymaker. You see what I mean? So being able to speak that language. And then one of the interesting things that I've come to appreciate about science is that we often get so focused on methods, right, and the way of knowing and the epistemology of the thing that we get sidetracked from issues that actually matter, right, and actually change facts on the ground. And I would encourage any young scientist who wants their work to shape the public conversation, or even more importantly, public policy, to ask every question that you ask as a scientist, ask yourself what the policy analog of this should be. What does this suggest about the world? And if you don't have a good answer, that's fine. You don't have to yet, right? But remember, policymakers are constantly making decisions. That we don't have the luxury of waiting for future research. Do you see what I'm saying? And so if you recognize that to be the case, and you know that your work can animate something, then I think it is the responsibility to stand up and say, I know, right? I'll say this. As a professor, I always knew that my PhD students were ready to graduate when they could comfortably say, I don't know. Because I think the exercise of getting a PhD is becoming comfortable with the vastness of knowledge and what you actually don't know about that knowledge, right? What are the bounds of your expertise? And the problem with that is that most people don't think that way. Most people, the nature of ignorance is to claim knowledge, and the nature of knowledge is to claim ignorance, right? And if you think about it that way, that's why we have a bunch of really ignorant policymakers making decisions and scientists being like, I'm not sure. And so when you recognize that that's just the social pressure behind what you do, there's a responsibility to be able to step up and say, actually, I know a lot more than you do, right? And to call it how you see it. Truth has a moral implication to it. And the last thing I'll say on this issue is that we have sort of devoided science from the moral imperative for truth. And if we believe something to be true, then it has actionable responsibility that comes with it. And our failure to make that actionable, that carries moral weight. And I think there's a responsibility for the community to come to grips with the fact that we don't want to be doing science in a vacuum, because we're not doing science in a vacuum. And the world right now, when it comes to good information, can feel a lot like a vacuum. So if you're doing the work that fills that void, then be a part of pushing that work out in the world, right? So thank you for the question, and for all of you guys who are really pushing the public conversation to be more rigorous and more scientifically oriented, thank you. But keep doing it, because again, right, the people who don't know tend to speak the loudest, and the people who do tend to be the quietest. So.
I want to thank Dr. El-Sayed for inspiration, for us voters, for activists, for scientists. That was really phenomenal.